All right, good day, everybody. And I am here today with a guest that I probably have to say I have been the most excited to speak to in a long time. So I have Bruce Pardy today, professor of law at Queen's University. Bruce is a lawyer and academic, a very outspoken critic of the legal progressivism in Canada's growing managerial state. He's taught law in Canada, the US, New Zealand. He's practiced civil litigation, and he has served as an adjudicator on Ontario's Environmental Review Tribunal. Most recently, he has become a leading voice in Alberta for Alberta independence, and has even gone so far as to pen a Declaration of Independence in February of this year. So he's been a frequent guest on podcasts and at local events here in Alberta, traveling a little bit more these days. And I would say that he offers a very bold and refreshing legal lens on the separation debate. So, Bruce, thank you so much for joining me. And it is absolutely fabulous to see you again.
Nadine, it's great to be here. Thank you so much. The honor is mine.
Oh, well, wait till the end, then you can decide. I am going to jump right in with you because we have so much to cover. And the reality is, you are not afraid to tackle the really tough and sometimes controversial, I would even argue unpopular subjects. So I want to get started here right away. But before we do, I have a simple question for you to ask. And that
Mhm.
is, you wrote the Declaration of Independence for Alberta, which, considering you live in Ontario, is somewhat striking. And but what motivated you to take such an interest in Alberta politics, and in particular the Alberta separation movement?
Fair question. So it's not just that Alberta has had a raw deal. I mean, it is that, and some of us from outside Alberta can see that. But it's also that the state of the country is such that Alberta right now is the country's best hope. And what I mean by that is this: the the potential for serious and fundamental reform of the country as a country is almost non-existent because of the nature of the vested interests, the way the constitutional structure has been established, the nature of federalism, and so on. The prospects for actually getting Canada to sit down and acknowledge the fact that it's going down the tubes is very, very small. And so one of the ways, and perhaps the only way right now, the only potential way to disrupt the political landscape in this country is to have Alberta decide to go its own way. Now, I don't just mean that as a fake. I mean that really. I mean, I think Alberta should go its own way, and if in the course of doing that, it causes an earthquake substantial enough to cause other things to change in the country, then great. It could cause a domino effect. It could cause a cascade. It could cause other provinces to think the same. Who knows? It could even, if things got existential enough, cause the federal government to face the fact that its cash cow might be leaving, and be pressed to reassess how things work in this country. I don't know if that's possible. I suspect the chances are pretty small. It doesn't matter. Right now, the best shot at some kind of fundamental change in the country is Alberta, and I think Alberta, in pursuing its own best interests, I don't think Alberta's responsibility is to fix the country. I think Alberta's responsibility is to look after itself, and in the course of doing that, it might actually have the effect of bringing fundamental change to the country.
Now, it's interesting because what do you think here is at stake for the rest of Canada if Alberta separates?
Well, I hope Alberta separation would be a trigger for the country or at least other parts of it, to save themselves, because right now Canada is really broken. Only a few people from coast to coast, I think, are willing to see it that way, but um, things are really in a mess. And to fix the mess is not just a policy problem. A lot of people, even in Alberta, like to complain about federal policy, and fair enough. There are a lot of bad federal policies, some of which are treating Alberta unfairly, many of which are causing all of the difficult problems that Canada is encountering, whether it's immigration or housing or cost of living, or the list goes on forever. But it's not just a policy problem. Policy is a very short-term, immediate moment in time thing, and it changes with events, it changes with governments. The problems that we have in this country are not merely policy problems, they're fundamental problems about the Constitution, about the architecture, about federalism, and about the way Canada sees itself, the way those who govern Canada think of their role. And those are the kinds of things that need to change.
Now, that's a lot. Um, because if you think about it, you've just basically said that Canada is broken. I would argue that Canada is not necessarily broken. It's actually working very much the way it was designed to work. And that was to use Alberta as that cash cow, and the West in particular, to fund the activities in the East. So I think for the East, the Quebecs and the Ontarios, Canada works perfectly. I think
I
real
I completely agree with you. There's no question. Alberta and Saskatchewan were established as outposts to provide the center with the resources to do as they wish. I just happened to come across a timeline of population, and I forget the exact figures, but they were doing moment in time populations, how populations have grown over time. And there's a snapshot in 1867, the time of the BNA Act, the British statute that created the original Canada, and the population of Ontario at the time was something like 1.2 million or something of that, in that range. And the population of Alberta was something like 20,000. In other words, nobody lived in Alberta. Everybody lived in Ontario and Quebec. I mean, literally so. And so when we go back to that period, I mean, Alberta didn't become a province until 1905. But even in 1905, relative to Ontario and Quebec, there was nobody there. And so, yes, at the time, the people who were in Canada, Ontario and Quebec, and in the Maritimes, thought, well, there's this distant territory, land out there. We could bring it into a confederation and it can supply us with stuff. And that kind of made sense at the time, but the thing is, the idea persists. And the word I like to use is cash cow. And the fact that Alberta is Confederation's cash cow gives Alberta leverage. That's why if it holds a referendum and the referendum passes, its potential departure is in fact going to throw a wrench in the way Confederation exists. It's going to put the whole thing in doubt, which is good for Alberta.
Well, we're already seeing separation movements now, not only on the West Coast, but also on the East Coast with Newfoundland and Labrador. I think Quebec would be very jealous if we actually beat them to separation, uh, which is why I think they're sort of somewhat sympathetic to Albertans right now. But, it's a lot to say that the system is broken, and I mean, what would you do to change it? Because this is the battle that goes on with a lot of Albertans. They thought for a long time, the Reform Party, for example, the West wants in. We thought that we could make meaningful change to be a partner in Confederation. And regardless of the numerous attempts, I would argue that pretty much everything has been attempted from a political negotiation standpoint. It hasn't happened, and I don't think it is going to happen. So, with that in mind, what do you think could be done to make the changes necessary that might convince Albertans that this is a worthy partnership to continue to pursue?
Oh, I don't think there are any that could possibly be made. I don't mean that they couldn't be made in theory, but I don't think they can be made in the context of the present political moment. I would like to persuade Albertans not to pursue the idea that they are going to resolve this without holding a referendum. I do not think any negotiation should be going on before a referendum. And here's why. All you can ask for, and all Premier Smith has asked for, is policy change. She sent a letter to Prime Minister Carney. It describes, 9 policy asks. Everything from emission caps and tanker ban and pipelines and single plastic use prohibitions and so on, asking the federal government to reevaluate and reassess and remove or reverse these policies. And in my opinion, and ironically, I suppose, the worst thing that could happen in Alberta's interests is that those policy asks would be met. And why do I say that? Because in the short term, that would be very advantageous. The point is that those things are necessarily short term. That's what policy is. Policy changes from moment to moment and government to government. If you get those policy reversals, they are just as likely to change back again in 3 or 5 years. The problems in Canada are deep. They're structural, they're constitutional, they're foundational. And the only way to get Canada to confront those is to put its existence in doubt. And so for my money, if I was running the show, no negotiations until after the referendum. And even then, the Supreme Court of Canada has said holding a referendum on a clear question that a clear majority adopts triggers an obligation to negotiate. And it is a political negotiation, not a legal one. And sure, so at that stage you negotiate. But here's the way you know whether or not you are winning or losing a negotiation in this kind of scenario. If Alberta is going to the federal government to make requests, as in, if you don't do this for us, we're going to leave. Okay? If you do that, you are losing. You are winning if the federal government comes to you and says, how about this? How about that? Would you please stay if we do this? Now you're winning, because it is more important to them that you stay than it is to you that you stay. If you actually want to go, then you're going to go unless you get an offer that you can't, so good that you can't possibly refuse it. That's what you want. Otherwise, you're better off on your own.
Yeah, one of the things I've been saying to people here, who have this, I think I'm going to use your term, romanticized vision of Canada that they hang on to, whether or not they want to negotiate better terms, or whether or not they want to separate, or whether they want a 51st state, regardless of any of the options that are available to us, all of it hinges upon the 50 plus 1% that's needed in a referendum, because I think that is the only political leverage that Alberta has. Now, you were with us in Red Deer at the event with Dr. Wagner, and he gave a great historical account. And I love the fact that Danielle stands up and makes these 9 demands, because I agree with you. The worst thing that could happen is that they actually meet them. Not that they will, but that would be the
No,
worst thing.
there's no real chance that they will be met. But even so, yeah, please carry on. Yeah.
Yeah, and so even if they did meet them, it really just puts the fire of separation just back to that kind of simmer mode. And realistically, the history of Alberta has proven over the 120 years and longer that we'll just be having this conversation, or rather, you and I won't, but our kids will be having this conversation in 40 years from now, right? We've gone through this with the NEP. We've gone through this, numerous times again and again and again. And it's not just a liberal or a, government problem. Like you said, it's not just policy, it's not just government. The Conservatives have done this to Alberta just as much as, the Liberal government has done this. So it is a structural problem and systemic. It's not just policy. And so few people bring that out as articulately as you do.
Yes. Well, back to your use of the word romanticized. So here, this is part of the difficulty, I think, part of the challenge for Albertans, and not just Albertans, but a lot of Canadians hold an idea of the country in their head, of a country that does not actually exist. There's an imaginary Canada and a real Canada. And the imaginary one, as you say, is romantic. It has fabulous features. It's the one we like to live in our heads. But the real one is very different. And the real one is failing. Now, I don't mean that it's failing, and I agree with the point that you made earlier, which is, no, this is the way it was more or less designed. Fair. But it is failing the people. It is becoming a place where it is becoming difficult to live, to be free, to prosper, and all of those important things. And I hope that people will take notice of the real Canada and the real state that it is in, as opposed to the romantic version, the imaginary version that they have in their heads and they want back. You can't get something back that doesn't really exist. And one of the dangers here, if I can put it this way, is that in confronting this problem, Albertans, who are, after all, Canadians too, that they will be that they will be too Canadian about this. And by that I mean they'll be well-meaning, they'll be overly reasonable, they'll be a little bit naive, and they will assume that everybody is acting in good faith. And those are not correct assumptions about the real Canada. I think you have to assume, whether it's true or not, that the people who oppose you, the interests that oppose you, the political interests that oppose you, will do everything in their power to make sure it doesn't happen. After all, going back to the idea that Alberta is the cash cow of Confederation. If this cash cow, goes through the steps that the Supreme Court mentioned, you hold a referendum and this, the majority approve it, you check the boxes and you say, right, we're leaving, goodbye. Do we really think that the powers that be are going to just let that happen? No, because that departure is threatening the way the country works. And that is an existential threat. And you better believe that there are going to be forces in this country that will do everything in their power to defeat it. So this is nothing less than a political revolution. And political revolutions are difficult and dangerous, and people have to be prepared for struggle.
So on that note then, because I think, that creates some fear in people. But I also see fear, my fear of staying is far greater than my fear of leaving. So for those people who just go, well, things are okay, I'm comfortable. Um, what what legally is a sound path then to Alberta's separation? Because we have to be prepared to struggle a little bit in this process. I agree with you totally. And it's not going to be easy because, as you said, any wounded animal backed into a corner is going to fight to survive. And I think, it would be a very fatal blow or a very seriously wounded blow to Canada if Alberta were to leave. Because, I mean, if you take a look at the Maritimes, for example, New Brunswick, I think Nova Scotia, 1/3 to half of their budgets come from equalization payments, which is basically propped up primarily by Alberta. So we are funding the rest of Canada. The Canada Pension Plan, which is something I've spoken here about, Alberta starting its own, same thing. We put in an extra $3 to $5 billion a year to fund the retirements of people in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and Labrador. That money never comes back to Albertans. And so for me, the fear of staying is far greater than the fear of leaving. And I'd much rather have the fight today myself rather than to pass it on to my children and their grandchildren to have it again in 40 years. It seems to be a cycle that we run through. But
Yeah.
what would a legal pathway be then for Alberta to separate?
Yes, the legal pathway is very simple, but it's also uncertain because of the nature of the beast. So in 1998, the Supreme Court of Canada heard a reference case about Quebec. And they said in that case that, yes, it is possible for provinces to leave. And the path is to hold a referendum that asks the population of the province a clear question about leaving. And if a clear majority support that referendum, then that will trigger an obligation to negotiate on the part of the province and the rest of the country. Now, one point they made very explicitly is they said passing such a referendum does not create a unilateral right to leave on your own terms. But on the other hand, the rest of the country, including the federal government, does not have a unilateral right to stop you. You're into political negotiation. And they also emphasized the political as opposed to legal nature of the negotiation. They basically said, after that stage, the courts are out. So you have to resolve this yourself. And people like to ask questions about, well, what would happen if this, or what would happen if that? For example, at the Red Deer event that we were both at, somebody asked this question. They said, well, let's say the referendum passes. And the federal government refuses to negotiate. They just say, no, we're not talking about this. Go back to where you were. What happens then? And the answer is nobody knows, right? Because you have a political obligation to negotiate. The Supreme Court has at least suggested that you can't run back to the court to say, well, they're not doing it right. You have a political environment. And at that stage, we have to make it up. Remember, this has never happened before in this country. And we don't know. So we have to take the minimal guidelines the Supreme Court has given. We have to follow those, and then we'll end up in a place where it's unknown territory and do the best we can.
So the process to all of that is step one, yes to a referendum. And then, it's not really in the court's hands, is what you're saying. It truly does become a political matter. Now, if that's indeed the case, you have a lot of opponents here in Alberta who, for whatever reason, it boggles my mind sometimes how people don't necessarily see logic and the sentiment to belonging to Canada is so strong. But they all will often try to bring up the Clarity Act as a
Yeah,
reason why
yes.
we cannot get out. You cannot get out. And I'm like, yes, we can get out. There is a legal path forward to that. But I
Yeah.
mean, they're saying that essentially, the government is a gatekeeper. They're going to use the courts to ensure the enforcement, and we've seen that with political decisions that have happened. I think the courts have been very politicized and weaponized. You're seeing lawfare, but from
Yes.
your legal perspective, then what are the actual limits on the federal government and federal authority, the courts, when it comes to the right to separate?
Right. Well, so first, let's just consider the Clarity Act and what it is. The Clarity Act is a federal statute, and that statute is sort of expresses the federal government's belief and understanding, at least at the time it was passed, of the Supreme Court decision that I was describing. In other words, they've taken that decision and said, right, we believe that these are the requirements that they were expressing. It's a federal statute. So that means number one, it it um, it is able to be amended by Parliament, and number two, it is only the expression of the federal government's view about what the requirements are. Now, there's no reason why the Alberta government legislature couldn't pass its own Clarity Act and say, well, we've read the decision too. here are our requirements for Clarity Act. Now, the federal government wouldn't accept that as a legitimate um, indication of what the requirements are. But now you have contested visions of what is needed here. People people are inclined to look to the law for certainty, right? They say, well, those are the words of the statute, or those are the words of the Constitution, or the Supreme Court of Canada said this, and they want to, and understandably, they want to leap to, well, that's the way it is then. But law is a cultural phenomenon, and it's not static. It evolves too. Here's one of the many things that could happen. Imagine this. Let's say the present federal government referred another case to the Supreme Court on Alberta separation. It's a new Supreme Court, different judges, different than in 1998. Maybe this Supreme Court today would say, oh, well, but the rules for Alberta separation are a little different than they were for Quebec. In other words, in some respect, the old decision was not quite right, and we're going to fix it now. And you get suddenly new rules that are more onerous, just say in theory. Okay. Well, this underlines the point I'm trying to make about a political revolution. Alberta needs to get to the point where it's clear that its people will not put up with anything less. They just won't do it. And that provides political legitimacy to the cause of leaving the country. If you have a population that has said loud and clear, this will not do, we do not consent, we do want out, whatever the path is, that's the path we're taking, then, the federal government can put up rules and obstacles and negotiations and so on. But in the end, in theory, that is the sentiment that will win out.
So it
And so
truly
technically,
is,
yes, yeah,
and it
go ahead.
has to be that grassroots movement from the Alberta people themselves. It's really
Yes.
because I don't even see our politicians. Like I know Danielle Smith has made her 9 demands, and she's talking about giving them a few months to kind of see how that goes. But then even on the energy national interest projects and shortening that timeline down to 2 years, I don't think Alberta has 2 years to wait to see whether or not this is going to
No,
work. And why would this
no.
time be any different than any other time? So I think it's somewhat foolhardy. She is a federalist. She's made that very clear. And in a premier's dinner, she had said, in which I attended, she actually said it is her job to make sure that we don't get to 50 plus 1%. I mean, it's one
Right.
thing as the premier to say, look, I'm the premier of the province of Alberta. It is a province of Canada, and I have an obligation to, and to clear a path to justify it that way. But to come out and say it's my job to ensure you don't get to 50 plus 1, I mean, for what I tell people, we have to get to 50 plus 1. That's the first step. But then either we have to, as Albertans, politically pressure our politicians to make sure they're doing what we want them to do, or we're still got challenges that we're going to be facing on the political front, I think, under the United Conservative Party.
Well, yes, so it is not just, to your point, and I agree with it. It is not just the federal government you have to persuade. You have to persuade your own leaders that their own interests lie in getting to the front of this parade. Because if they don't, they're going to be lost in the wilderness, in the political wilderness. You're going to leave them behind. Yeah. So the challenge for Albertans is to persuade not just the federal government, but its own political leaders that this is what's going to happen, and it is in the interests of those Alberta politicians to get to the front of this parade, because that's where the parade is going. And if they don't, they are going to be left in the political wilderness. Right? They Politicians of all stripes everywhere act in their own self-interest, and that's not a knock on them. That's what everybody does. And it just has to be clear that that's where their interests lie. If it's not clear, if Albertans themselves as a population are middling about this, they're sort of half in and half out, and they'd like a better situation, but they don't want to go full throttle. they're fond of Canada, they want to stay in it, but they also want to be out. That's not going to do the job. They there has to be a grassroots determination that being out is better than being in, and that they will not tolerate being in anymore because they tried and tried and tried and tried and nothing worked, and this is the only real choice left.
Yeah, I think that's for going to be a big part for a lot of even conservatives who are separatists. They're trying to work with the current party, which is okay. But I mean, even Danielle has talked about doing a referendum. Maybe you can provide a legal opinion on this, because as I understand it, the referendum question has to be one question. One clear question with one clear majority. Now, she's talking about doing a referendum in 2026 in which there's a series of questions. She's going to put out, to me, that's a feeler. I'll put out a feeler and we'll see just where people are at and what people want to do. It's not a referendum on separation. So I think that's a very different scenario. And then there's also the binding. Like in Alberta right now, I don't think there's any legality around if we have a referendum that the government is bound to act upon it. So maybe you can comment a little bit on that aspect, because I mean, federally, everybody focuses. I understand that, and that's where we need to be focused right now, 50 plus one. But the reality is, then there is a next step to this, and that next step, I think, is going to have different political actors involved than the ones
Yes.
we currently have today.
The kind of referendum you're describing, you know, it is a referendum, but it's not the kind of referendum that the Supreme Court was describing. That referendum needs to be on a clear question. That is a clear single question that indicates that yes or no is meaningful. The majority of the population has to clearly indicate that it wants out. No ifs, ands, or buts. If the whole thing is conditional, then it's watered down, it's not clear, and if it's in other words, if it is open to interpretation about what the population means, then it won't do. So the one thing that Quebec had that Alberta right now does not have is, if I can put it this way, our René Lévesque, because René Lévesque championed the cause. He was determined to try as best he could to ensure that Quebec left Canada. Now, ultimately, he failed, but everybody knew who was leading the parade. Now, I'm not saying that Danielle Smith. I don't know. I'm not an Alberta political watcher. I don't know this territory as well as many others who are in Alberta. I'm not going to say that Danielle Smith can't be that person. I don't know, but it would be a much better shot if that kind of person or persons emerged as the head of the parade, as opposed to it being only a grassroots thing.
Yeah, so it needs strong leadership and some sense of direction, vision that somebody can convey articulately, what the next steps constantly are. Um,
And and as you know, there are people around who are providing that, but they are not right now political leaders who are presently in power.
Yeah, and it's really tough to get, as talk about broken systems, it's very difficult to get into the system to become that political leader. So it really is going to have to be somebody from outside of politics, in my opinion, who really steps up and into it, because it's just having spoken from personal experience, getting into the system, if you cannot be controlled, they cannot control what you say, when you say it, how you say it, to whom you say it, then you're just not welcome, right? But so when I did 1905 committee, one of the things that I had realized with the last 7, 8 years in politics is that politicians only respond truly to political pressure, and that's a direct threat to their position. That's what I found most effective. I took a lot of heat from a lot of people who were conservative, even people who were on my side. Oh, Nadine, you're being too hard on the people who were there. They're doing their best. And I'm like, no, I'm done with excuses. Because that's exactly what it is. Either you have a commitment to follow through, to see something through. And I'm about accountability and transparency. I don't think we need to play political games I think we just have to be honest with people, transparent, and then be accountable for the decisions we make. But with that in mind, I want to take us a little different direction here on the same topic because you wrote an article. In independent Alberta, Aboriginal rights should not exist. Now, before everybody jumps on my comment section around this one, because I'm sure it'll be full by the time we're done, I want to read a few parts because this
Yes,
is a
sure.
hot topic here. I think, you get hereditary chiefs here who think they have way more power than they actually have. And I think there is so much confusion. And I think you just summed it up in this short little document so quickly. And then I want to really dive into this because you're one of the few people who I think have the level of understanding both on the legal, social, cultural side of it, but more importantly, also then willing to talk about it because you want to see people bring up Aboriginal rights. Lots of people think different things, but they are not willing to openly have the discussion for fear of the repercussions. So, on this article, bear with me a minute. You
Sure.
talk about an independent Alberta and honoring or not to honor the Aboriginal rights. Treaties, so far right now, advocates are saying they would honor treaties, right, and Aboriginal rights. And that I love how you use special status because it's privilege, right? Special privilege. And you'd already commented here earlier about one rule of law. The law should apply equally to everyone. But under what you're hearing, even Danielle Smith say, you're hearing the Alberta Prosperity Project say, is that, oh, no, 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 we'll continue with all this. So you challenge that, which I love. So it would be the new country's first big mistake. I love
Right.
that statement. That's bold and right to the point. You talk about Aboriginal rights are widely regarded as the natural and proper order of things, but in fact, the opposite being true. And then you give a little bit of a history lesson in Britain about, the Saxons, the Romans, and then the Normans, and how they're all British. There's no differentiation of one group over another. And so when you talk about it here, you say in Canada, this old idea has been reconstituted as a progressive imperative. And that's that lineage was destiny, right? So whatever family you were born into, whatever your lineage was, that would determine your future. They also have rights no one else claimed depending on their lineage and group affiliations. So it's you reference it to a caste system because it truly is, right? That old
Hmm.
colonial British caste system, where special hereditary rights possessed by one racial group to the exclusion of all others. This special status has not operated to the benefit even of most Aboriginal people. And I would totally agree with you on that. You have leaders who line their pockets, and I love the fact that you bring up the Aboriginal industry because bureaucracy, government, consultants, lawyers, I mean, there are so many people dipping into that cash cow. Um,
Hmm.
and then a new Alberta should abandon the Canadian Constitution. And this is the part I was really interested in because you say in abandoning the Canadian Constitution, when we write our own Constitution, Aboriginal rights do not have to exist. Now, treaties, because that falls into this too. You say Indian treaties were agreements with the Crown, and in an Alberta Republic, the Crown would have no status, neither would its deals. So, this is one I want to dive into a little bit. And this is going to go kaboom when we talk about this because these are the hard questions. And you got the Alberta Prosperity Project and Jeffrey Rath, who, for better or worse, um, you know, has somehow taken it upon himself to make determinations on behalf of all Albertans as to what the new Alberta would look like as far as citizenships and treaties. Even Danielle Smith to make it, oh, we would honor treaties. Well, I think we could do much better. And so, when you wrote this, what were your thoughts around how would we deal with the Aboriginal rights and the treaties of the First Nations people that are here?
Yes. Okay. So let's start at the beginning. And the beginning is this: when you are leaving a country, you are not just leaving the country itself. You're leaving its established order. I mean, you're leaving because you don't approve of the way it works. So the first mistake you would make is to simply carry over the way it works and all of its premises and principles and foundational ideas. And in Canada, Aboriginal rights is one of those foundational ideas. So imagine if you're Alberta and you're leaving. Metaphorically, what you're doing is wiping the table. You've got a clean table, and you're gathering around the table to decide together, all right, how we have a new country. How's this going to work? And that doesn't mean that you can't borrow from other places. But the place that I hope Alberta would borrow from, first and foremost, is not Canada, but the United States, because the US Constitution is superior to the Canadian Constitution. You don't want a Westminster system of government. You don't want the Crown. You don't want the Charter of Rights. And you don't want Section 35. Section 35 is the provision in the Canadian Constitution that guarantees Aboriginal rights. Now, why don't you want that? Well, because if what you want is a free country subject to the rule of law, one of the features of such a country, in my view, is the idea, as you referenced, that the same rules and rights and freedoms apply to everyone, regardless of who you are, regardless of your lineage, regardless of your parents, regardless of your origin. And Aboriginal rights are in direct contrast to that. Now, the Aboriginal rights idea is so deeply embedded in the Canadian psyche that there are understandably negative reactions to that, because, well, how can you say that? This is not right. I mean, we provide these rights to Aboriginals because of what we did to them, right? Well, the fact of the matter is, we didn't do anything to them. This is all a long time ago. And migration and mixing is the history of humanity. This happens everywhere, a lot, all the time. If you look through history, you mentioned the British example. This is one of many, many, many examples. The Romans came in and tried to conquer it, and then the Saxons came in and established their rule, and then the Normans came in 1066 and established their way of doing things. And time passes. Now, the moment after an invasion or a migration, of course, the people who live in a place are going to try to resist the invasion. Of course. Nothing wrong with that. But that happens in a moment of time. And then you look back, and if you're in Britain today, let's say you made this proposition. Well, the Saxons were here when the Normans arrived. And therefore, because the Normans won and took over, the Normans owe special rights to the Saxons. And so if you're a descendant of a Saxon, you have these rights. And if you're a descendant of a Norman, then you don't have them and you owe these things. Okay? We all know that would be ridiculous. Absolutely
Nation
ridiculous.
within a nation, which is what Canada is right now.
It's crazy. And you can create and find these kinds of historical conflicts anywhere you want to look, between the English and the Scots, if you want, or as the case may be. Eventually, you have to say, all right, enough. We have mixed together. We are now a people ourselves in the new country. The people who are in the country, the people who were born in this country, are all native to the country. And it doesn't matter whether your parents were born in Italy or in Britain or in Canada. If you belong to the country, if you're a citizen of the country, then you have citizen rights. And the attempt to try and figure out what you are and what I am because of how many ancestors I have on this side and that side and from that line, that will not do. We are all the same. Now, we can have our own distinct cultures. We can have our own distinct groups. I mean, free people can group together as they wish. I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't think of themselves as one thing or the other, and they shouldn't live together if they want to, because they're free to do that. But as far as the law is concerned, the law of our free country is blind justice. Blind justice means the law does not inquire into who you are, what your identity is, who your parents are. And this idea that there are some people who deserve, because of some historical fact that happened centuries ago, deserve a different status than others people I don't think can stand. Now, to your other point, which I also referred to, this, of course, has acted to the detriment of many Aboriginal people. And this sounds ironic, right? Because they have special status. They have more rights to different things. Now, let's just be clear about this, first of all. Every Indigenous person in Canada has the same rights as every other Canadian citizen. They are entitled to do anything that a Canadian citizen is entitled to do. They're entitled to vote. They're entitled to own property anywhere that they want to. They're entitled to buy and sell it. They're entitled to marry who they want to. They're entitled to divorce as they see fit, and so on and so forth, all the way down the line. There is nothing that a non-Aboriginal person is allowed to do that an Aboriginal person is not also allowed to do. But in addition, there are special rights and privileges that some Aboriginal people, depending upon their affiliations and lineage, also have. They might have special tax exemptions. They might have reserve rights. They might have Aboriginal title rights. They might have the rights to special treatments in criminal prosecutions, and so on and so forth. Right? Those are the things that cannot stand, because we are not all different. We are all the same in basic legal characteristics. And the group that has benefited the most, again, as you pointed out, are both Aboriginal elites and the non-Aboriginal part of this Aboriginal industry. I mean, the amount of money over time that has gone to this cause is astronomical. Astronomical. It's even hard to tally it up. It's not recorded in very clear terms, understandably. People don't want to, the governments don't want you to see how much money is being spent on this. But given the amount of money, you would think that all Aboriginal communities would be pristine and fantastic, whereas some of them, and I want to emphasize some of them, because one of the mistakes that we make in this country is to pretend that Aboriginal communities are a monolith, like they're all the same, and they're all different. They're all different, just like Aboriginal people are all different, just like non-Aboriginal people are all different. And so it's very difficult to make generalizations, but there are certainly some Aboriginal communities that are in very bad shape. And you'd think with all the money that's been poured into this cause over time, they wouldn't be that way. Why is that? Well, because the money's somehow going somewhere else. And so Aboriginal individuals, as well as the rest of us, would in fact be better off anyway if this kind of system came to an end and we were all treated by the law in the same way.
That's one of my favorite things that I've always advocated was one rule of law that applies to everybody equally. Blind justice, as you said. It shouldn't matter what your gender, what your race, what your heritage or your lineage. If you are a Canadian citizen, then that's what the law protects, is the Canadian citizen. And in this case, it would be the Alberta citizen.
Correct.
Is
Yes.
there anything though, because people say that, okay, well, the Aboriginals will never let Alberta separate. As far as my understanding goes, is there's no real legitimacy to that. Each Aboriginal person has one vote that they get
Mm-hmm.
to cast as an
Mm-hmm.
Albertan
Mm-hmm.
on a referendum ballot as to whether or not they choose to stay or to go. Is there any other legal consequences or anything that you're aware of that could change that?
Well, this is going to be one of those things that is going to be contentious, probably in a negotiation. So, just hypothetically, here's one of the ways in which the forces aligned against separation could proceed. The federal government, for example, could say, all right, you had a referendum, the referendum passed. We're going to negotiate with you now. Here's one of the terms of our negotiation strategy. If you don't provide for Aboriginal treaty rights, then we're going to say, no, you can't leave. And we're negotiating with you. That's the condition. The condition that we are putting on you, your departure, is you recognize the rights that the Crown arranged long ago with Aboriginal peoples under the three treaties. Okay, that could easily happen. And then Alberta would have to decide, all right, well, how do we proceed? Given that proposition put forward in the negotiation, how are we going to deal with this? Because we are not going to proceed with a country in which different people have different rights.
Yeah, and that's it's going to take a strong, principled leader to do that. I mean, I'm hoping we can find that person to do that. So on that note, then, because there are international laws that can acknowledge and recognize countries as, I mean, I love people who talk about Alberta separation like it's never been done anywhere in the world. Oh my God, it's this new phenomena. There are countries that separate all the time. I mean, Kosovo, Canada granted Kosovo, its own independence, for example. So it would be very hypocritical of it, in my opinion, for it to deny Alberta its independence. So on an international standpoint, even if the federal government and they rallied every group that was opposed against us, there are international ways, I think, in which Alberta could recognize its independence. Is there not?
Yes, so let's just say this about international law. International law pretends to be more than it really is. International law is not really a codified set of rules at all. It's a reflection of what countries actually do. And so, yes, one of the questions that is going to hang in the balance in this kind of process is whether a and Alberta declaring itself to be independent will be recognized by other countries. Now, other countries will make their own call about that. And you might do well and you might not do well. And this is one of the uncertainties that lie before Alberta as it proceeds on this path. There are no guarantees of anything. International law neither prohibits it nor allows it according to hard and fast terms. So it is, as the Supreme Court of Canada decision reflected, this is a matter of politics, international politics too. So let's say, for example, that the federal government on Canada's behalf managed to rally, as you described, all the important players on the international scene, the other countries, and persuaded them, all right, folks, nobody recognized the new Alberta. We don't want to lose Alberta. We want it to stay as the cash cow of Confederation. Don't do that. And let's say they all go along, and Alberta gets no international recognition at all. Okay, that's going to be a tough spot. But it's just as likely to go the other way. And the fact of the matter is, we don't know.
I think it
So
would be
you
more. I
can't.
think Mr. Trump might help us out there. I think
I
if Alberta
certainly
got a
hope so.
50+1%, I think the next day, if I know Trump's Twitter account at all, it would be congratulations to Alberta on winning their independence.
That could very well be so, and I would not be surprised at all. But in other words, this goes back to the point about the referendum. People understandably want to see what's beyond. Like, okay, so we do have a referendum. What happens after that? Like, show me the path. Okay, the path is unknown. What happens is unknown. Like, take your courage in your hands and move forward and deal with the problems as they arise. Because if you try to resolve them too early, you'll miss the boat on the thing that's right in front of you.
I think that's really important for Albertans to hear, is that we are not going to have all the answers because we're not going to have all the problems. To take one step, then the next step, and then the next step, just, eat the elephant one bite at a time. And I
Yep.
think for me, I always tell people, what's the worst case scenario? The status quo.
Yes.
Would you agree
Yes.
with that?
100%.
So, I
Yes.
mean, our Alberta's worst case scenario is that nothing changes. We go through this, we have a referendum, and we make some effort, and everything stays exactly the same.
I mean, the other way to put it is, what do you have to lose?
Yeah.
Right? If you
So,
if Canada is not working for you, and it's not, and that's abundantly clear, I think. The it's it's almost a no-brainer, because the thing that you're leaving is the thing that you want to lose. And then if it doesn't work, then you're still back to where you were in the first place.
now you went into law. When you went into law, I'm sure very different world back then. But the reality is, you went into it, with probably a more idealistic view of, where things are currently at. You have made mention that Canada has gone wrong. Like it's on the wrong path. How did we get there, Bruce?
Right. Well, so I want to acknowledge the point that you made, and it's a very good one, which is, to a certain extent, where we are now is a product of the way it was put together. It's not that something has suddenly changed. It's that where we are could be characterized as the maybe not inevitable, but not unsurprising destination result of the way things were set up. Let's first start with origin stories. The origin story of Canada versus the US. And origin stories are not necessarily embedded in specific provisions of constitutions, but they make a big difference in the way that people think about things. The origin story of the Americans, of course, is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They wanted out from under the thumb of the crown. They did not want to be subjects anymore. The case that the Americans made at the time was that the British king was not properly treating them as full British subjects. It wasn't that they didn't want to be British. It's that they did want to be British. They wanted to be treated properly as Brits.
Sounds like the
And
Alberta story.
That's right. That's right. And in many ways, Alberta, in a metaphorical way, is in the same kind of situation today as the Americans were back then. They are not being treated well by a distant authority. And that authority could decide to change that, but it won't. And so the Americans said, well, we don't want to be subject to your whims anymore. We want out. And so our founding story is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, if you like, Canada can be described, its existence can be described as reactionary to the Americans, as in Canada consisted of the people who did not want to rebel. They're the loyalists, the monarchists, the people who don't want trouble, the people who wanted, to be under the thumb of the crown.
Canadians are so nice.
Canada is built, one way to put it is, Canada is built on deference to authority. And you can see that in our Constitution. It's not life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. It's peace, order, and good government. Right? That means we will decide, do what you're told. And part of that attitude persists today. It also persists in the way the government is structured. I mean, you can see that in the way the Senate still exists. In 2025, in the year 2025, our Senate is still appointed. And the distribution of seats is as it was when provinces first entered Confederation. I mean, back in 1905, when Alberta had, only so very few people, it had only a very few number of seats. Ontario and Quebec both have 24 seats each in the Senate. British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba together have 24. Now, at the time of entering Confederation, those numbers might have made sense. But one of the functions of the American Senate is to offset the effects of representation by population. Right? So in the House of Representatives, it's by population. So if you are a more populated state, you have more seats. In the Senate, every state has 2 seats, regardless of size. It's an offsetting of the distorting effect of population. In our Senate, the Senate makes the problem worse, not better. Those areas that have the most population have the most Senate seats. And the federal government appoints them in any event. Okay, so this makes no sense. No sense at all. But it is a reflection in part of the idea of deference to authority. Appointed seats, these number of seats for these regions. Canada has always been a collection of regions in conflict, always. And it's always been an unlikely country being held together, at one point by a railway. You build a railway and we'll stay. And Quebec's history is very much part of that, but it's not just Quebec. The regions of Canada have always been in tension, and frankly, it's a small miracle that this hasn't happened before now.
So on that, because we touched a little bit there on the monarchy, if Alberta were to separate, because I'm a big fan, as you suggested, that it should be a constitutional republic, but you
Yes,
do have some people proposing that we could remain a commonwealth, which, people today go, oh, but Canada, the king, he's just a figurehead, which
yes,
is not accurate. I mean, every politician swears an oath to the crown. We have crown
yes,
corporations, we have crown lands. So can maybe you just
yes. So,
clarify?
well, I like to put it this way. It's all a little murky, right? But I like to try and put it this way: the king, the individual, yes, is more or less a figurehead, but the crown is a real entity that holds the power. Okay, the crown owns most of the land in Canada. And yes, the elected politicians can control what the crown does, mostly. Um,
Well, they've been granted authority to make decisions, but it doesn't belong to them, correct? Like
well,
the
yes.
crown,
So
it is crown land.
it is crown. It is crown land. Now, so one of the difficulties with the combination of the monarchy and the Westminster system of government is that it doesn't have a very good separation of powers. Let me go into that just a little bit. In the American Constitution, the state is divided into three distinct bits: the legislature, that is Congress at the federal level; the executive branch, headed by the president; and the courts. And those three branches together are supposed to be, number one, they're separate, their functions are different, and they're supposed to be checks and balances on each other. And the president, although he does have a role in the legislative process with his veto, he doesn't sit in Congress. He is actually the head of the executive branch. The general rule is the executive branch, the agencies of the executive branch, the departments and so on, require a legislative mandate in order to be able to act. So the legislature ultimately controls, or is supposed to control, with a few exceptions, but mostly the legislature controls what the executive can do. And that's easier to visualize because they're different groups of people. In the Westminster system, we have the same idea, but we have the same people heading both. So the cabinet heads the executive branch, all the ministries and so on, but they also are the main people in the House of Commons. So we say, well, we have separation of powers, but the people are all the same. So there's a mixing, and there is still a separation. The same idea is still found in the middle down there somewhere. That is, that the executive branch action still requires legislative mandate. But the executive branch heads can just go to the House of Commons and put in the statute because that's what they want to do, because they control the place too. Right? So one of the flaws of this Westminster system is a muddled separation of powers between legislature and executive, which the Americans have sorted out much, much better.
So the type of legal system then, should Alberta separate, it sounds like, what we have, that's my biggest fear, is that people try to recreate what we're leaving. And I have no interest in recreating the problems of the Westminster system and the current parliamentary system that we have.
Yep.
I think there's much better ways of doing that. And so from the sounds of it, you would agree that
Yes.
leave that system
100%.
behind.
100%. So let's put it this way. What Alberta is trying to get away from is not just the Canada outside Alberta. It is also the Canada inside Alberta. And there is a lot of Canada inside Alberta. And one of those things is the way the Alberta government works. The Alberta government is also a Westminster system of government. The Alberta government is also a managerial state. You want to get rid of both those things and start again. You do want to fashion a constitutional republic. You want to use the US Constitution as a starting point, take its best attributes, and leave behind its flaws, because it has some problems. This is a great moment to do again what the Americans did. Here's what the Americans did. They took the best bits of British rule, British government, British law. They brought it over. They brought the common law over. They used those things that were good, but they also left behind the things that were awful, like the monarchy. And they fashioned their own version of things. I hope Alberta will do the same thing. It will take the best of the American experience and leave behind those things that have proven to be problematic, and fashion for yourselves potentially the best constitutional architecture in the world. I mean, Alberta could save Western liberal democracy. It could save Western civilization. It now has the potential for turning the page on this bad place that Western countries generally are in, and especially Canada.
Yeah, I think ideologically we've gone so far down the socialist path. We are literally on the doorstep of communism, which I think is such a dangerous ideology. And I mean, it's being taught in our schools. We're seeing, that whole statement about great times, good times make, weak people. It's
Yeah,
it begs the question. I mean, we're living through it, I think. Um, then just on that note, then with respect
right.
to the succession movement,
Well, so
um,
can we just pause on that for a moment before you go on?
sure.
Let's just go back to the communist thing, right? Because there are some litmus tests for Albertans in this moment to see, how much they really mean it. And what a lot of them are saying, thankfully, is no, we want a free country, and thank God for that. But here's one of the several litmus tests. It's not the only one by any means, but I think it's my favorite one, which is healthcare. Right?
You
Okay,
had to
Alberta.
bring that up, didn't you?
I did. I did. Alberta, like the rest of Canada, has a socialist system of healthcare, a communist system of healthcare. The two countries that have a healthcare system most like ours are North Korea and Cuba. Okay? If you really mean that you want a free country, then you do not want and will not put up with a single payer healthcare system. Do not think that you can leave Canada and pretend to have your own free country and carry on the Canadian system of healthcare that you have. That is just fooling yourself that you're getting something new, which is really actually old.
Well, in my opinion, I mean, I think it's been proven. People are beginning to realize that I call it the great myth. There's a few great myths in Canada. One of them is that we
Yes.
have this, again, that's that romanticized
Yes.
vision of what Canada used to be. Oh, they have public health care. Everybody has got health care and nobody gets turned away. And, we demonize the American system. But, if you think about the cost of health care, in Alberta, the cost of healthcare per person is about $9,000 per person.
Yeah.
That's a lot of insurance money to a
Yep.
public system where I could go in and get a hip replaced, next week, not have to go on a list where maybe in the next 2 years I get my hip replacement. So I always tell people, people in Canada have this idea that they can receive something for free. The Canadian public seems to think that taxpayer money is just, somebody prints it, right?
Right.
Nobody has to
Right.
earn it. Well, printed money
Right.
at some point has to be paid back, and not only paid back, but right now this country is paying $50 billion of interest on
Yes.
borrowed money. And
Yes.
nobody wants to talk about it, but that borrowed money is to private individuals. They go, oh, but we're paying it back to ourselves. No, we're not. Right?
No.
The government has the right to print the money. They chose
Yes.
to outsource that to a central bank, which
Right.
is a private entity,
Yes.
and you
Yes.
pay interest on it, right?
Well, this is one more thing that you might want to avoid in a new Alberta. Don't have a central bank.
Yeah,
Don't
well,
don't don't debase your currency.
I'm going to tell you, I worked in aerospace and defense. Um, and I learned a lot. And one of the things one day I woke up and I went, I know where the next 7 wars are going to be fought. And somebody looked at me and went, what? And I went, I can tell you right now. And I wrote them down. I said, I can tell you right now, I know where the next 7 wars are going to be fought. And you know how I figured that out?
Hmm.
They didn't have central banks.
Right.
Because again, it's about control. It's not about, we're
Yes.
not living in a system of freedom, right? We're living in
Right.
a system where they want you to have the perception of freedom.
Yes.
They want you,
So can so you know what my favorite word for this is? People sometimes hear control and say, "Well, you're just being a conspiracy theorist." People don't want to exercise control over you. The word I prefer because it reflects the insidiousness of it is managerialism. We are a managed people, and by that I mean our governments have become so um, so dominant and have seeped into every corner of our lives that they think, and quite genuinely, many of them, the people who work for government, whether they're elected or bureaucrats or the like, they believe, and actually a lot of the people do too, that the purpose of government is to manage society, like to fix social problems, to manage things for best outcomes, to develop policy about this and that and this and that. And and that's only one of the possible answers for what a government is for. And so, my aspiration for Alberta is that not only do you ditch the Westminster system of government and the Crown and the central bank and Aboriginal rights and healthcare, but you ditch the managerial state itself. You do not accept the proposition that the role of government is to manage society. Reject that idea. If you do that, then you're on your way.
yeah, and there's a great book. Frederick Bastiat wrote a book called The Law. It is this little 80-page. I love Frederick
I
Bastiat.
have it on the shelf just over there.
Oh, I have about 3 copies of it. I lend it out all the time. These are the books that should be in our public school systems. I mean, if
Okay.
we're going to have a public school system, then let's educate our children.
Well,
And
funny you should say that. Funny you should say that about public education. We can talk about that some other time, perhaps. But this is one of the questions. Are you sure that you want a public education system? Because here's one of the features of any public education system. It's run by the state, and therefore the state is going to necessarily be telling you all what your kids are going to be taught. And
it
that's
starts
probably
with
not a good idea.
daycares, Bruce.
Yes,
Like it
yes,
starts with
yes, yes,
daycares. When we took women out of the home and put them into the workforce, we then handed our children over to let the state be
yes,
the primary caregiver, primary instruction, because that's what
yes,
education, it's not an education anymore, it's an instructional system. So that is definitely, I
yes,
am not for any of that.
yes,
Unfortunately, a lot of Canadians still believe, well, you can't function without a public, system, which is just ridiculous. And
right.
and as far as the proper role of government, the law of Frederick Bastiat is a great starting point for people to just take a look at what things could be like.
Mhm.
Because the role of government, in my opinion, was to protect everybody equally under the law, right? Is to make sure that your individual rights were not infringed upon, and
Yes,
that I couldn't infringe upon your individual rights. So, like, it
that's
was a and that's not how it's worked out. It has turned into this centralized planning, socialist, the government knows best, which always boggles my mind because you can't get two people to agree on anything. And yet people forget that government is a group of people trying to agree on something,
yes,
right? How
yes,
is it that
yes.
my dad used to say this, Nadine, they were just Joe Blow yesterday. They get elected to government and now somehow they're like superior to everybody else. And the legal system, treats them superior to everybody else. Everybody else, it's like celebrity status. It just cracks me up a little
Well,
bit.
that's because the system's based upon authority. The election gives them legitimacy in the eyes of the courts, and frankly, in accordance with the rules of that system, it should. If they come along, so I don't want to go too far off the path, but this is one of the reasons why people were perplexed about COVID, right? So they brought actions to court and said, "Yeah, but this policy makes no sense. I can show you. Here's the data. What they did doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. So please tell me it's illegal." And the answer is No, that has nothing to do with it. They have authority. It doesn't matter if they're right or wrong. They have authority. And if they said this, then this is the thing that goes.
And that is the proper role of government, is to ensure that can never happen. Is, that's what we implement a government for, is for that very protection. And so right now, I mean, the people who need to be protected, we actually need to be protected from our own government, is what I'm seeing,
100%. That's
right?
correct. Correct. And so that comes when all of you get around the big table and say, right, we're getting a newly independent country. How are we going to make this work? And that's where you need to draw up your new constitution. It's going to be great.
So, on that cautionary note, what advice would you give to Albertans right now? There's a lot of people who are very afraid of this, and like you, see this as a huge opportunity. So, what advice could you give Albertans today?
This is your moment. Like, don't miss it. This is your moment. It may never come again. If you are ever going to stand for yourself, on your principles, for your children, for the people around you, for your communities, to do something that you know in your gut is correct, then find the courage within you to do it, and insist on nothing less. This is not a time for equivocation. Equivocation will be the end of the project. You must insist that you will take nothing else. And without that, it's toast.
All right. Now we are going to need a new constitution and a new legal system. And that means, Bruce might have to just relocate to Alberta and become that new first elected. I like the idea of electing officials, including judges. Why should they be appointed?
Well, so this is you're raising a very good and interesting point. It's been a long-standing dilemma about judges, because here are the tensions. Democracy is great, but democracy can also come close to mob rule at times, right? So you don't want that either. So part of the thing about a republic is it does have democratic elements to it, but it also has individual rights. And one of the balances has to be, all right, what areas do we carve out where the mob cannot go, even when they want to, even when they elect people that say we're gonna take that down. The Constitution has to be such that that becomes not possible to do. And that's one reason why formulating the new Constitution is such an important thing, because it will set the path for a long, long time.
Wonderful. Well, I think that was a lot to digest, but I think the elephant is much smaller than it was when we started.
Got to kill that elephant.
Poor thing, we're just torturing it one bite at a time here. But it's so overwhelming for people, and so many people are demanding all the answers, which there's just not all the answers to give, and we do just have to take it one step at a time. But I think for me, reiterating the risk is worth the reward, and that let's not recreate or hang on to the mistakes that Canada made, like in Aboriginal rights, which, we went into a little bit more than I think most people are even willing to have the conversation on, because it is such a contentious issue. And there's just so many other things like that, public education, and people want all those answers now. It's like, no, we get to decide those answers, but we can't even have that conversation until we get to that 50 plus 1%.
This is also an adventure. I think people need to see it as an adventure. This is an adventure that, well, doesn't usually come around ever for most people, for most of their lives. This is an adventure into the unknown. This could be a really important moment in modern history. Alberta could change the path. I hope people will not turn away. Instead, they'll turn into it and take on the challenges that the moment demands.
Wonderful. I think that's a perfect place to end it. Thank you so much, Bruce, for taking the time to speak to us today, to share your thoughts. And I'm guessing you and I are going to have another conversation sometime soon.
Oh, I hope so. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a great day. If everybody would like to like this video, please do share it. I think it offers some very unique perspectives that and different topics that a lot of people are shying away from, and different perspective on how Alberta separation can proceed. And so please do like, please do share, subscribe to the channel. And if you have comments, we love to hear what it is that you're thinking, what your concerns are, because we can address them. We'll have Bruce back on here. If you have questions for him, please do send them to us and we'll make sure that we get you answers. So God bless you all.